John, how currently you see the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine, and how is that going to be considered in the current situation with the negotiation between the two parties? Because after all, it all comes to Ukraine and their economy, their sort of
Hmm.
manpower. You know, is Ukraine in some sort of disarray? Some sort, is Ukraine getting more aid, less aid from the Western, supporters? Because from the numbers we're getting from the West, from basically from Europeans, it shows how drastically the support to Ukraine in terms of money,
Hmm.
equipments, and weapons, they're reducing. And we had, recently, 2 days ago, we had a 80 tons of equipment going to Ukraine from Poland, from the
Hmm.
United States to Poland, then to Ukraine. But these are not that much influential when it comes to the battlefield and how the battlefield is, you know, escalating. Russia yesterday they have announced more than 100 of Ukrainians were killed in one single day on one front.
Hmm.
And how do you see the situation on the battlefield, and how is it going to be considered in the current negotiations?
Well, you have lots of guests also talking about the military position on the battlefield, most of whom read, just as I do, the Russian military bloggers. Um, Boris Rajin, the Colonel Kassad website, um, Mikhail Zvinchuk, the Reba website, and there are several others. Um, these provide ball by ball, day by day, hour by hour coverage. In addition, President Putin has just had a lengthy meeting, pardon me, last week with an extended defense board meeting in which General Gerasimov was attending. The defense minister presented a report, and Putin has summarized the current position. So I won't test everybody's patience by repeating it. On the one hand, you have major pockets of Ukrainian forces surrounded. So whatever comes in from the Polish border into Lvov, Kiev, can't get through to the front now. Can't. Um, the second, the Russian position has been to move very slowly. And if folks want to understand how that works, tactically speaking, I can refer to Mark Takash, Hungarian major, specialist in analysis of land warfare. And he produces approximately every 2 weeks a pretty interesting and balanced assessment of how the two sides fight over relatively small areas and why the Russians are winning in each of these areas and how it's done, up and down the line. Up and down the line, the Russian position has been exactly as President Putin has said. If we can't achieve our territorial objectives, including our security, that's the demilitarized zone, deep enough to protect our territory from attack by drone or missile in the future, if we can't achieve it by diplomatic means, we'll use force. And force is what's working. As you mentioned, each day, and our audience can read it, the Defense Ministry produces a daily operational bulletin. And you can see a summary of each of the major army groups up and down the line, and a summary of the casualty rate. The casualty rate's been between 1,400 and 1,550 a day in the last few weeks. That's considerably higher than it was earlier on. Whether one argues the veracity of the particular numbers, the rate increase is the important number. It's a level of increase as the Russian forces move slowly but surely westward across the Dnieper River, as deep as it's necessary to go to secure the four regions and a deep demilitarized zone, deep enough to protect against future attacks. I think it doesn't need more repeating than that. What the Ukrainians are capable of doing, and their allies, is fight elsewhere. They can't make any headway. They're unable to mount any counter offensive. There are no reserves left on the, let's call it, the land battle. Instead, they're doing what we've talked about as the sea battle. And we've seen them also persist with the aerial battle against Russian targets, Russian refineries, and so forth in the Russian hinterland, as well as in the Novorossiya new regions. This is pinprick warfare, not insignificant, but mainly to demonstrate what's false. It's to demonstrate that Ukraine can go on winning the war when that's false when applied to the land war.
Let's zoom out a little bit, John, with what's going on in in the Caribbean. The United States has decided to, let's say, attack these tankers, oil tankers, who are going to Venezuela, coming from Venezuela.
Yeah.
How do you see the whole picture with the Trump administration? On, you mentioned the war, the attack, drone attack on Russian tanker, but when it goes to Venezuela and other parts of, you know, here in Latin America, people are not happy with what's going on in Venezuela. But after all, Donald Trump and his administration is doing whatever they think is right for the United States
Yes.
and would benefit the United States. But the whole case of foreign policy of Donald Trump with these attacks on tankers, what are they pursuing, in your opinion?
Well, the they is complicated. This is a bit beyond my competence to talk about the US faction fighting. And there's a kind of a Rubio line, which isn't the same elsewhere in the administration. Let me say this bit. Let me quote you what Rubio said, because I referred to it a minute ago. It gives you some sense of what he thinks he's doing. He was asked at a briefing on the 19th, basically to respond to Foreign Minister Lavrov saying that it would be a fatal mistake for the US to try to block oil tankers. I'm looking down to read it exactly. To block oil tankers from Venezuela and trying to overthrow the Maduro regime. What do you think you're doing? Your question, Nima. Rubio was asked, and here's his reply. Yeah, we're not concerned about an escalation with Russia with regards to Venezuela. I mean, we've always expected them to provide rhetorical support for the Maduro regime. I think they have their hands full in Ukraine. And if he's watching Sergei, meaning Sergei Lavrov, Merry Christmas. But at the end of the day, I expected them to say what they were going to say. Rhetorical support, we understand what that. It's not a factor in how we consider this whole thing. Okay? So there's Rubio saying we're going to do whatever we want, no matter what the Russians say. He wasn't asked about what the Chinese say, but there are two parts to the Trump announcement of a cordon sanitaire, a blockade against Venezuela. First of all, Trump said, we're going to get back all US assets that were nationalized and are now apportioned out to Russia and China. China's the largest investor in Venezuela, and it's yet to explain how it feels and what it proposes to do if its investments in Venezuela, not simply its trade, not simply its oil trade from Venezuela if its assets are seized by the United States. That puts China and Russia at loggerheads with the United States on the question of who owns mining and oil assets in Venezuela. The second part's the blockade. From the way I understand it, this is a very large bluff on the part of the Trump administration. It is reluctant to land forces and overthrow the regime directly by fighting. The cost, the risk, we've talked about it before, the Bay of Pigs risk is too great. I assume there is a faction or more than one faction in Washington that wants to provoke a kind of Gulf of Tonkin situation in which by seizing or searching or attacking vessels, there will be a Venezuelan counterattack against a US vessel, which would then become Vietnam War style, Gulf of Tonkin style, the justification for a massive attack. There seems to be a certain amount of US support for this kind of provocational line. For the time being, President Maduro and the Venezuelan regime are staying cool. They understand this sort of provocation. They've also they've exhausted the negotiating prospects, in which Maduro did offer, it appears, did offer some investment concessions to the United States, and they were rejected. So we're in a provocation stage in which my own bet, but I can be very wrong, my own bet is Venezuela will not be provoked and will call Trump's bluff. At the same time, it would appear that Rubio is keener to attack than others, whether they're in the Pentagon or in the White House. I don't know. But let's come back to what I do know a little bit more about. First, Russia isn't broadcasting what it's actually doing to assist Maduro to improve his deterrent capability, to call Trump's bluff, to prolong the standoff, to raise the risk of US casualties if there's an actual attack on Venezuela. The air defense, internal coordination, many things. If I knew them, I wouldn't be talking about them. Rubio is simply grandstanding by being so unpleasant to Sergei Lavrov. He ought to be directing his misguided sense of humor at the GRU, the Russian General Staff's intelligence service, and at the Russian Defense Ministry's capability to build up Venezuela's defense, because the longer the standoff goes on, the more time Russia has to assist Maduro to build his defenses. The stronger he has his defenses, the better his deterrent. 1 point. Second, what about China?
The key is China, John.
Well, it's not a key exactly, because the question is, has China got any military capability to deter the United States in this situation? Or does it have any economic, commercial, or trading capability? We don't want to say China is the world's largest paper tiger, but in Venezuela, what exactly is China proposing to do to safeguard its investments? Yes, it's made, as Rubio's caricatured Lavrov, general statements about the sovereignty of Venezuela, the folly of US actions on the blockade, on sanctions and so forth and so on. But if the US push comes to shoving the Chinese, what are we going to see? Well, we have yet to see China exercise any form of military muscle outside the Taiwan Straits.
Yeah.
So we can expect that China would not have a military capability, but we know it has significant economic deterrent capability because it used the rare earths and other embargoes on the exports to the United States rather effectively. So if there's what we're saying here is if Russia's busy trying to prolong the standoff while it helps Maduro develop deterrent capabilities, defensive capabilities on the military front, what's China doing to create an atmosphere in which the US might find the economic costs of confronting Chinese investment in Venezuela aren't worth pursuing so aggressively? I'm putting it rhetorically. I think it's obvious to everybody what these questions are, but I don't know the answers. We'll see. But the longer it takes for us to see, the better off both China, Russia, and Maduro's position will be, and the worse off Trump will be, leaving aside Rubio.
Yeah. John, before wrapping up this session, how do you see the numbers, the number of casualties, dead and wounded for the war, the battlefield in Ukraine on the part of Russians and Ukrainians? Recently, the Russian side put out some sort of numbers, but your take on what's going on, what has happened so far? How do you see the numbers?
That's a question I haven't studied carefully enough to give you a precise answer. I can say, pardon me, that the British propaganda organs have made the claims that they estimate from measuring funeral notices and burial notices and probate filings that the level of Russian casualties exceeds 100,000. I don't have the current number. I've read the stuff. That's a very large number. It's a very serious number. It has very considerable implications throughout the country. And some of those were expressed quite openly during President Putin's Itogi Goda, results of the year press conference with people on last week. This is a significant level of destruction of Russian lives, which makes Russia's advance on the battlefield cautious. Same time, the measures, pardon me, of Ukrainian casualties are so much higher than the British, the Americans, the so-called NATO think tank estimates have been, and I'm not even counting as serious, Zelensky's tiny numbers. You can see the ratio in the exchanges of bodies, a grim business, but you can see that the ratio of Russian bodies recovered versus Ukrainian bodies recovered and exchanged is somewhere between 1 to 10 and 1 to 20. That's a ratio which, if you applied it to the actual battlefield, comes within the range of some of your military guests who talk about the normal, let's say, war fighting norms about the ratio of deaths to wounded and so forth. So my own guess is the same as all your other guests make. It's a guesstimate that the ratio of Ukrainian to Russian is somewhere more than 1 to 10. 1 Russian death, 10 Ukrainian deaths, 1 Russian wounding, and so on. And there's the other standard military algorithm between death and wounding. I can't get into it because I lack the expertise, and I don't have I've got a million papers around me, but those are not any of them. But let's make a general point to be clear for our audience. The level of casualty on the Russian side motivates caution. And in Takasha's independent analyses of tactical operations, you can see the caution. You can see the time it takes for the Russian side to prepare an advance on a tiny amount of territory before it moves. This caution is a political promise of the president to the Russian people. It's why, notwithstanding a uniquely, unprecedentedly high casualty rate for Russia, the president and the army receive from the Russian people enormous and stable public approval. Public approval is not for death. Public approval is for just war and sacrifice, regrettable, sad, tragic, awful, terrible, but a sacrifice to defend Russia against a greater threat. And there's no doubt that from a Russian point of view, the level of casualty has not triggered public opposition of any kind that the Western allies expected or believed they could foster inside Russia. Pardon me. What do we see on the Ukrainian side? Well, there's certainly the capacity to fight on. Deterred, yes, on the battlefield by the Ukrainian habit of shooting people trying to surrender in the back. There's no doubt, and Putin referred to it last Friday, that the revenge killings that the Ukrainian forces are inflicting on civilians in towns and villages and sites as they retreat. They kill just because they've lost. This is terrible. It's happening. It tells you something about the Ukrainian casualty rate. There's a much bigger number. Ukraine is half of the size in population terms that it was at the beginning of the war. Let's say half the country has run away. And that half isn't going to come back. It's not simply that they've moved to Poland for the duration, or moved to Germany, or moved to further west in Europe. The Ukrainian population's casualties have the live casualty of the war is half the people of the Ukraine, and they've left for good if they can maintain their residence abroad. That's an enormous casualty rate that isn't usually measured when we think of death, body bags, and wounds or casualties of that kind. So I would place the numbers in that balance. Ukraine has basically collapsed, and it's done it over 3 years and it's measured by the refugee numbers, the influx numbers of each of these countries, and so forth and so on. Ukraine is half the population it was. Inside the Ukraine, the casualty rate is roughly speaking 1 to 10 against the Russian casualty rate.